There are things a woman carries for so long that she stops noticing the weight. She stops noticing because the carrying becomes the shape of her days, becomes the rhythm of her breathing, becomes so thoroughly part of who she is that she can no longer tell where the burden ends and she begins. Margaret Elaine Solano was 67 years old, and she had been carrying things since she was 22. Since the morning she married a man named Dennis Solano in a small church in Cedarwell County, Virginia, in a dress her grandmother had sewn by hand on a borrowed sewing machine in the back room of the house on Holler Road. While the mimosa tree outside the window was in full bloom and the air smelled like something that was trying very hard to be a promise. She had believed in the promise. That was the thing she would return to. Years later, sitting in the dark of a house, she would come to love in ways she had not thought herself capable of anymore. She had believed completely and without reservation, the way young women believe when they have been taught by good people that love is a thing you tend like a garden, that if you are faithful to it and patient with it and willing to work through the difficult seasons, it will sustain you. Her grandmother, Cecelia Holler, had believed this. Her grandmother had been right. But the garden Margaret had chosen had different soil than she knew, and by the time she understood what she had planted herself in, she had already given it 41 years of her life and 2 children and every dream that had not survived the marriage's long, slow rearrangement of what she was allowed to want. Dennis Solano was not a violent man. She had said this to herself so many times over the years that it had become a kind of defense, a wall she built around the truth of what he was so that she did not have to look at it directly. He was not a violent man. He was something more patient and more persistent than violence. He was the kind of man who understood that control administered quietly, over years, through the gradual erosion of a woman's confidence in her own judgment, was more durable than anything that left marks. He understood that if you told a woman often enough, and in the right tone, that her ideas were impractical, that her instincts were off, that she was lucky he was there to manage what she could not manage herself, she would eventually stop having ideas. She would stop trusting her instincts. She would stop trying to manage anything at all, and she would call this arrangement love because she had forgotten that it had been something else once, before he had slowly and methodically made it into this. She had given him 41 years. She had given him the house they built together in the first decade of their marriage, the 4-bedroom colonial on Meridian Drive that she had chosen, and he had slowly taken ownership of in all the ways that matter, the accounts in his name, the decisions made in his name, the neighborhood relationships cultivated in his name, until the house felt like something she lived in at his permission. She had given him Nathan, their son, who was 40 now and who had learned from his father how to occupy a room, how to take up space in a way that left less of it for anyone else. And she had given him Claire, their daughter, who was 38 and who had, in the final years of the marriage, aligned herself with her father with the particular loyalty of a child who has understood that loyalty is the currency of survival in a household like theirs, and who had chosen the side that cost her less. What she had not given him, though not for his want of trying, was the property on Holler Road. Her grandmother, Cecelia Holler, had been dead for 11 years. She had died at 91 in the same house where she had been born, in a bed by a window that looked out over the back field where the mimosa tree grew, and she had died as she had lived, which is to say deliberately and without unnecessary drama, and with a very clear idea of what she was doing. 6 months before she died, she had called Margaret to her bedside on a Sunday afternoon in October and had pressed in her hand a sealed envelope and said, in the voice of a woman who has something specific to communicate and intends to communicate it precisely, "This is for you alone. Not for your marriage, not for your husband, for you alone, and I have made certain of it." Margaret had not fully understood at the time. She had been in the middle of the marriage then, which is to say she had been in the middle of the long unconscious that the marriage had produced in her, the state of managed not knowing that Dennis had cultivated so carefully over decades. She had taken the envelope and put it in her personal documents folder and had, she was ashamed to think of it now, mentioned it to Dennis that evening at dinner, told him her grandmother had given her some papers, some property documents she thought. He had been very calm about it. He had asked a few questions in the casual tone of a man who is not particularly interested. He had said that was nice, that she should probably look into it at some point, that old properties could be complicated, and he had moved the conversation on to other things. And Margaret, who was in the middle of the long unconscious, had let it move, and had not looked at the envelope for 3 more years. When she finally opened it, she was sitting alone in the house on Meridian Drive on a Tuesday afternoon while Dennis was at work and both children were long gone to their own lives. She opened it because she had been going through her documents folder looking for something else entirely, and the envelope was there under her hands with her grandmother's handwriting on the outside, her name in Cecelia Holler's careful script, and something about the quality of that handwriting on that particular afternoon made her stop. Inside the envelope was a deed. The deed to the Holler Road property, 43 acres of land in Cedarwell County, including the farmhouse where her grandmother had lived her entire life, transferred entirely and without condition into Margaret Elaine Solano's name alone, dated 18 months before Cecilia's death, and witnessed by an attorney named Robert Vane whose address was listed in the county seat. There was also a letter, 3 pages in her grandmother's handwriting, which Margaret read twice on that Tuesday afternoon while the house on Meridian Drive was quiet around her and the light came through the kitchen window at the angle it came in mid-October. Her grandmother had written, "I have watched you for 30 years and I have loved you for every one of them, and I have been afraid for a great many of them. I am not a woman who speaks easily about fear, but I will speak plainly to you now because I am running out of time for anything other than plain speech. The land on Holler Road belongs to the Holler family by 3 generations of work and love, and it has always been intended for you. I am giving it to you alone because I believe you will need it to be yours alone. I cannot say more than that, without saying things I am not certain enough to say. But I know what I know about how a person carries themselves when they are free and how they carry themselves when they are not, and I have watched you a long time, my Maggie. The land is yours. Whatever comes, the land is yours." Margaret had put the letter back in the envelope. She had put the envelope back in the folder. She had gone to make dinner because Dennis would be home at 6 and dinner needed to be on the table, and she was, at that point in her life, still doing things in the order that his presence in her life required them to be done. But something had changed on that Tuesday afternoon. Something quiet and internal. The way a geological shift is quiet and internal before it becomes evident on the surface. She had read her grandmother's words and felt them settle into some part of her that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for exactly that kind of plain speech. I know what I know about how a person carries themselves when they are free. It took 4 more years. She was not proud of that. But she would come to understand that those 4 years were not failure. They were preparation. The slow and mostly unconscious work of a woman who had been asleep for decades gathering herself, without quite knowing she was gathering herself, toward waking up. The end of the marriage was not dramatic. She would say this to herself the way she said most true things, plainly and without embellishment, because the plain version was already enough. There was no single event, no revelation, no discovery of the kind that arrives like a blow and reorganizes everything in an instant. There was instead a morning in March, a Tuesday, the sky outside still gray and the coffee still brewing, and Dennis saying something to her over the kitchen counter, something ordinary and dismissive about a decision she had made without consulting him, something about how she had always had trouble thinking things through, and Margaret standing at the kitchen counter with both hands flat on the surface and feeling, for the first time in perhaps 20 years, herself. Not a version of herself adjusted to fit the available space. Not the managed, diminished self that had learned to occupy exactly as much room as it was given and no more. Herself, the full and specific self that had existed before the marriage had slowly and patiently made her into something smaller. She felt it the way you feel something returning to your body after it has been numb, sharp and clarifying, and slightly painful, the pain of sensation coming back. She did not say anything to Dennis that morning. She was too surprised by herself to speak. She finished making the coffee, and she poured it, and she sat at the table, and she thought about the envelope in her documents folder and her grandmother's handwriting and the 43 acres in Cedarwell County and the mimosa tree she had not seen in more than a decade. She called an attorney that afternoon. Not a family attorney. Her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Drummond in the county seat, whose name she had found through a community legal resource she had looked up, somewhat shamefully, from an incognito browser window on the shared household computer. She left a message. She waited. Patricia Drummond called back the next day, and Margaret drove to the county seat to meet her on a Thursday morning, telling Dennis she was going to see her doctor for a routine appointment, which was the kind of small lie she had learned over decades to tell without guilt, because the guilt of the small lies was nothing compared to the cost of the truth in the wrong hands. Patricia Drummond was 62 years old and had been practicing family law for 35 years, and she had the quality, which Margaret had not known to look for but recognized immediately, of someone who has heard every version of every story and has not become hard, but has become very clear. She listened to Margaret with the focused attention of someone building an accurate picture, not rushing toward conclusions, asking precise questions, and waiting for precise answers. "The property in Cedarwell County," she said when Margaret had finished, "is yours outright. Your grandmother's transfer was properly executed and filed. Has your husband ever had access to it?" "He knows it exists," Margaret said. "I mentioned it once years ago. I don't think he's done anything with it." Patricia had looked at her over the desk with the measured expression of someone deciding how directly to say something. "There are structures," she said, "that can be put in place to protect property like this, in advance of any proceedings. Filings that establish your sole ownership clearly on the public record." Margaret understood. She said, "Let's do that first." It took 8 weeks. Patricia handled everything quietly and efficiently, and at the end of 8 weeks the Holler Road property was registered in Margaret's name with the same attorney's office that had handled the original transfer, the documentation clean and complete and entirely unambiguous. Margaret filed for divorce on the 9th week. She served the papers herself. She had thought about whether to do this, had discussed it with Patricia, who advised having them served professionally. But Margaret had decided she wanted to be present for the moment when Dennis Solano received information he had not anticipated and could not control, not to watch him suffer. She was not interested in his suffering. She wanted to be present for one moment in their 41 years together when she knew something he did not know she knew, when the balance of information was on her side for once, when she was not the person being managed but the person with the document. She set the papers on his desk on a Wednesday morning while he was reading the news. She said, "I filed for divorce. I am leaving next week. The house and the accounts and the arrangements are in the paperwork. My attorney will be in contact with yours." He looked at the papers. He looked at her. She watched something move across his face, the surprise first, and then the quick reorganization of a man who is accustomed to managing situations, and then, underneath both of those, something she had not expected. Something that looked, in the one moment before he covered it, like recognition. As if some part of him had understood that this moment was coming and had been waiting for it with a complicated mixture of dread and, she thought, almost relief. She left the kitchen before he could speak. She had prepared for every version of what he might say and had decided that none of the versions required her to be present for them. She went upstairs and she finished packing the 2 suitcases she had packed over the previous 3 days, one piece at a time, so as not to be conspicuous, and she carried them down the stairs, and she put them in her car, and she drove away from the house on Meridian Drive without looking in the rearview mirror. She drove south. She drove 6 hours with the radio off and the windows cracked and the spring air coming through at the angle it came when you were moving through it rather than standing still, and she thought about her grandmother's letter and about the mimosa tree and about the 43 acres she had not seen in more than a decade, and she felt the weight she had been carrying begin, very slowly and very cautiously, like something that has learned not to trust sudden changes, to lift. She had known the farmhouse on Holler Road would need work. She had prepared herself for that the way you prepare yourself for a difficult thing you have chosen freely, which is differently from the way you prepare yourself for a difficult thing that has been imposed on you. Chosen difficulty has a different quality. It is still hard, but it is yours, and that ownership changes everything about how you move through it. What she had not fully prepared herself for was the particular sensation of pulling onto the gravel track off County Road 7 and seeing the house for the first time in 11 years. It was a sensation she would struggle to describe later, to her daughter, to the attorney, to the few people who would come to matter to her in the months ahead. The closest she could come was this. It felt like being recognized by something that had been waiting a long time and had not given up on her. The house was standing. That was the first thing she noted, with the practical part of her mind that had been running assessments since she pulled off the highway. The structure was intact. The roof had issues she could see from the car, a section over the east wing where the shingles had gone and the underlayment was exposed, but the main body of the roof was holding. The porch needed work. One corner had dropped 3 inches from the rest of the line where a support post had rotted at the base, and the boards across the middle were soft-looking from where she stood. The windows were intact, which surprised her. All of them, every pane, whole and unbroken, grimy from years of undisturbed accumulation, but there and solid. The garden her grandmother had kept for 60 years was gone, or rather it had been reclaimed by the long grass, and the volunteer sumac, and the wild blackberries that had moved in from the fence line and made themselves at home in the absence of anyone to dispute their claim. She could see the ghost of it under the overgrowth, the deliberate lines of it, the logic of what her grandmother had planted and where, still present in the bones of the land if not in the living surface. She got out of the car. She stood on the gravel, and she looked at the house for a long moment. The late afternoon light was coming from the west at the angle it came in early spring in this part of Virginia, low and golden and very specific to this landscape, to the particular quality of the air at this elevation in this county in this season. She had forgotten this light. She had been living for 41 years in a place that had different light, and she had not known, until this moment standing on the gravel with the 2 suitcases in her trunk and the divorce papers back in Patricia Drummond's office and her grandmother's house in front of her, how much she had missed it. She had the key on her key ring. She had carried it for 11 years without using it. She walked to the front door and she tried it in the lock, which was stiff and reluctant with disuse, and she worked it with the patience her grandmother had always said she had in abundance when she chose to use it, and the lock gave, and the door swung inward, and the smell of the house came out to meet her. Dust and old wood and the specific sweet mustiness of enclosed rooms that have held the lives of people who love them and have been waiting in the dark for someone to return. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in. Then she stepped inside. She spent the first hour walking through every room, slowly, with the flashlight from her glove compartment because the electricity had been disconnected years ago, running her hand along the walls, testing the floors, opening and closing every door and window she could reach. She was doing an assessment, the methodical inventory of a woman who has decided to take something on and wants to understand precisely what she has taken on, but she was also doing something else that she could not have named precisely. She was relearning the house. She was letting herself remember what she had known as a child and a young woman in this space. The particular sound of the second stair which had always creaked on the left side. The way the bathroom door had to be lifted slightly on its hinges to close properly. The quality of light in the kitchen in the mornings, which her grandmother had called the best light in Cedarwell County, which Margaret had believed as a child, and which she saw now, standing in the kitchen in the last of the afternoon sun coming through the east-facing window, had been simply and accurately true. She made up the bed in her grandmother's room that night. She had brought sheets and a blanket and a pillow, had packed them deliberately with the knowledge that the house would need them, and that her first night here should not be spent in a sleeping bag on the floor if she could manage otherwise. She made up the bed and she sat on the edge of it in the dark, the flashlight off to preserve the battery, and she listened to the house. It settled around her with the particular sounds of old structures at rest, the minute creak and shift of wood that has been expanding and contracting through decades of seasons, the sound of the wind finding the small gaps around the window frames that needed recaulking, the distant sound of something in the field, a night bird she could not identify, calling and then stopping and then calling again. She had not cried on the drive. She had thought she might, but she had not, and she had not cried when she walked through the rooms, and she had not cried when she found the photograph still on the mantelpiece in the front room, her grandmother and grandfather on their wedding day, 1951. The grandfather she had never met standing very straight in a borrowed suit next to a woman who was 20 and already herself in the specific and total way that some people are themselves from the very beginning. She had not cried at any of that, but sitting in the dark on her grandmother's bed in her grandmother's house on her first night alone in it, she let herself cry now, without performance and without shame, the way people cry when there is no one to manage their face for, and when the reasons are too large and too numerous and too long accumulated for any particular one of them to be named. She cried for a while, and then she stopped. She lay down on the bed in her clothes, and she pulled the blanket over her, and she looked at the ceiling in the dark, and she made herself the same kind of promise that people make when they have nothing left except the clarity of what they intend. She was going to restore this house. She was going to learn what was on this land. She was going to stay. In the morning, she began. If you've ever walked into a place you haven't seen in years and felt it know you, felt the walls hold something of what you left there and offer it back. Stay right here, because this is exactly that kind of story. And if you're new here, hit subscribe before we go any further. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I want to know who's in this with me. The first week was inventory and repair. She drove into Cedarwell County seat on the second morning and opened a personal bank account, the first account solely in her name in 41 years of marriage, and deposited the cashier's check she had withdrawn from her half of the joint savings as part of the divorce settlement negotiations Patricia had begun. The amount was modest, not enough to transform anything, but enough to begin, and beginning was what mattered. She found a local hardware store on the main street of the town, which was called Holler's Hardware, which gave her a small, private satisfaction, and she spent an hour talking to the man behind the counter. A broad and deliberate man in his late 50s named Tom Birch, who had been in Cedarwell County all his life, and who listened to her describe the farmhouse and the state of it with the focused attention of someone who understands properties and their problems and does not need things repeated. He gave her a list. Roofing first, he said, before anything else, because a house with a failing roof is a house losing ground every time it rains, and the roof cannot wait for other priorities. He gave her the name of a roofer he trusted, a man named Carl Weston who had been working in the county for 20 years and who was competent and reasonably priced, and who would not try to sell her work she didn't need. He told her that the electricity could be reconnected through the county utility with a deposit and an inspection that would take about 2 weeks to schedule. He told her about the well, which she had not yet investigated, and what to look for to determine whether the pump was still functional or would need replacement. She thanked him. She bought what she needed for the immediate repairs she could do herself, the caulking compound and the weather stripping and the cleaning supplies and the work gloves, and she drove back to the house, and she started. She started with the windows because that was where the cold was getting in, and because sealing windows was something she could do with her own hands without expertise. She worked through the afternoon with the caulk gun and the methodical patience she had always had when she chose to apply it, moving from window to window on the ground floor, running the bead carefully along each frame, smoothing it with her gloved finger, the way she had learned from a home repair book she had taken from the library shelf in the house on Meridian Drive and read in the evenings in the bedroom when Dennis was in his study and had never asked about. She had always known she was capable. That was the true cruelty of the marriage. Not that Dennis had made her less capable, but that he had made her forget it. The knowledge had been there the whole time, intact and waiting, and it came back to her hands as she worked, the pleasure of a task understood and executed well, the satisfaction of a fixed thing where there had been a broken one. Carl Weston came on Friday morning and walked the roof with her and gave her an estimate that was serious but manageable. He said he could start the following week. She said yes. He said, "You're Cecelia Holler's granddaughter, aren't you? I can see it." She said yes. He nodded as if this settled something he had been wondering about and walked back to his truck. The electricity was reconnected in the third week. The moment the lights came on in the kitchen, Margaret stood in the middle of the room and looked at the light falling on her grandmother's cabinets and her grandmother's floor and felt something she would later describe to Claire, when Claire finally came, as something like the house waking up. As if the power was not just electrical, but something more fundamental, the house reasserting its intention to be inhabited, to be lived in, to be a place where people woke in the morning and made coffee and looked out the window at the field. She was alone. She wanted to be precise about this, honest with herself about what it felt like, because honesty had become, in these first weeks, the most important practice she had. She was alone, and she was 67 years old, and she had just ended a 41-year marriage, and she was living in a farmhouse that needed significant work in a county she had not inhabited in more than a decade. There were mornings, particularly in the first weeks when the work was heaviest and the social connections thinnest, when the weight of all of that pressed down on her with a specificity that was difficult to carry. She let herself feel it. She had spent 41 years not letting herself feel things that were inconvenient or difficult or that Dennis had indicated were excessive, and she was done with that. She felt what she felt. She named it accurately, and then she got up and continued. Her neighbors helped in ways she had not expected and had not known how to ask for. The farmer on the north side of the property, a man named Gus Pelham who was 70 and had farmed his land for 40 years, appeared one morning with a chainsaw, and the wordless practical intention of someone who has seen that a job needs doing and has arrived to do it. He spent the morning clearing the fallen oak that was blocking the south side of the driveway, the tree she had noted on her first walk of the property and had put on the long list of things to address eventually. He refused payment with a shake of his head that indicated the matter was closed. The woman at the end of the road, Frances Odom, who was 65 and sharp-eyed and direct in the way of women who have decided at some point in their lives to stop being indirect, came by on a Wednesday afternoon with a jar of preserved tomatoes and a quantity of local information that she delivered over coffee at the kitchen table with the efficiency of someone who has assessed a situation and concluded that the relevant parties need to be briefed. She told Margaret who in the county was trustworthy and who wasn't, who the good doctor was, and where the good food was, and what the county zoning board had been doing lately, which apparently was worth knowing. She asked no personal questions. She offered no unsolicited opinions about Margaret's life or her choices or what had brought her here. She was, Margaret thought, watching her drive away down the gravel track, one of the clearest people she had met in years, a woman who knew the difference between what was her business and what was not and had no interest in crossing that line. It was Frances Odom who first mentioned the old holler barn. She mentioned it in passing, on her second visit, in the way people mention things they consider common knowledge and are slightly surprised to find are not. She said, in the middle of a conversation about the property's southern boundary, you'll have to decide what to do about the old barn eventually. That foundation's been a question for a long time. Margaret looked at her. What barn? Frances looked back at her with a slight recalibration of her expression, the adjustment of someone who has just discovered that a gap in knowledge is larger than she thought. The holler barn, she said. The old one, down in the south field. Your grandmother closed it up before I moved to this road. So that's, she paused, calculating, that would be 30-some years ago at least. Longer, maybe. She put a lock on it, and she never talked about it, and nobody went near it. It's down past the ridge, through the tree line on the south side. You can see the roof line from the road if you know where to look. Margaret had walked every accessible part of the property in the 3 weeks she had been there. She had not gone past the tree line on the south side because the path in that direction was overgrown and she had been working her way through the more immediate areas closer to the house. She had not known there was a barn. There was nothing in the deed documents about a separate structure, or rather, the deed referenced outbuildings in the standard legal language that means everything and specifies nothing. She thought about her grandmother's letter. I believe you will need it to be yours alone. Whatever comes, the land is yours. She thought about 30 years. A barn locked for 30 years. She looked at Frances Odom across the kitchen table. Can you show me where to look for the roofline? She said. Frances Odom showed her the next morning, pointing from the south fence line to the place in the tree line where, if you knew what you were looking for, you could see the angle of an old roof breaking the canopy. Margaret stood at the fence and looked for a long time. Then she thanked Frances and went inside and looked at her to-do list and added, at the bottom, in handwriting that was very deliberate and very careful, the south field. She did not go immediately. She had learned, or was learning, the patience of someone who understands that some things need to be approached correctly, that the order in which you do things matters, that a door you have been waiting to open deserves the right kind of readiness. She finished the kitchen caulking. She finished the porch repair, 3 new boards, and a new post support that she and Carl Weston put in together on a Saturday morning after the roofing was done. She cleaned every room in the house from ceiling to floor, the particular cleaning of a space that has been closed for years, moving the accumulated stillness out through the open windows and replacing it with the smell of soap and fresh air and the specific quality of a house being brought back to life. She planted the near garden, the strip along the south wall of the house that got the best light, with the early spring seeds she had bought at the hardware store. She did this on her knees in the good black dirt with her hands, the way her grandmother had always planted, without gloves for this part because the contact with the soil was part of the point. She thought about her grandmother's hands in this same dirt. She thought about the 3 generations before that, the Hallers working this land through seasons she could not individually recall, but that were present somehow in the quality of the soil itself, in its willingness to receive seed. When the near garden was in and the house was clean and the roof was repaired and the windows were sealed against the weather, she put on her good boots and she walked to the south field. The path through the tree line had been a real path once. She could see that, worn into the earth by years of regular use and now soft with 30 years of leaves and growth, but still present underneath, still directional, still leading somewhere. She followed it through the trees, the canopy above her in early spring still thin enough to let the light through in long diagonal shafts, the forest floor damp from recent rain, the smell of it clean and complicated and very much alive. She came through the trees, and she stopped. The barn was larger than she had expected. It sat in a clearing at the south end of the property in the particular way of old structures that have become part of the landscape through long presence. The way they settle into the ground and the ground settles around them until you cannot quite imagine the place without them. It was built of the local stone, the gray fieldstone her grandfather had quarried from the property itself, and the stone walls were intact, fully intact, mortared and solid, and doing exactly what they had been built to do 3 generations ago. The roof was another matter. The center section had given way at some point, probably a decade ago by the look of the collapse, and the resulting hole allowed light and weather in. But the stone walls had held the integrity of the structure even through that, and the entry portion and the back wall were roofed still, the old slate tiles cracked in places but present. There was a door on the east face. A heavy door, solid wood planks with iron hardware, fitted into the stone frame with the craftsmanship of someone who intended it to last. And on the door, a padlock. Old, the chain dark with rust, the lock body heavy and oxidized to a reddish brown that was almost beautiful in the afternoon light. The padlock had not been opened in a very long time. Margaret stood in the clearing in front of that door for a long while. She thought about what Francis Odom had said. 30 years. 30 years sealed. And the woman who had sealed it was her grandmother, who had known things she did not say directly, but said through action, through the will that left the land in Margaret's name alone, through the letter that said, "I believe you will need it." She put her hand on the padlock. The metal was cold and rough under her palm. She did not have the key. She walked back to the house. She went to the box of her grandmother's things that the county attorney had held for 11 years after the estate settled, and that Margaret had collected from his office on her 3rd day in Cedarwell County. The box she had opened carefully and gone through piece by piece, the documents and the photographs and the small objects of a life. She went back through every item in that box. She looked at every envelope, every key, every paper, looking for something she might have missed. She found the photograph first, at the bottom of the box under a folded piece of cloth. Her grandmother and a man she didn't recognize standing in front of the barn looking whole and actively used in what appeared to be the 1970s by the quality of the photograph and the quality of the light, both of them looking at something outside the frame. Her grandmother was smiling in the photograph in the way she had smiled when she was pleased about something she understood but was not yet ready to discuss. And tucked behind the photograph, in the envelope she had not opened because the envelope had no writing on the outside, and she had thought it empty, a key, not rusted. That was the first thing she noted, with the focused attention she was bringing to everything these days. The key was old, heavy iron, the kind made to last, but it had been stored carefully, wrapped in a small piece of oilcloth inside the envelope, protected from moisture and oxidation. Someone had put this key away with the specific intention that it would still work when it was needed. She held it in her palm. She thought about her grandmother's hands, which had been capable hands, working hands, hands that knew the difference between storing something carelessly and storing something with intention. She closed her fingers around the key. Tomorrow, she said aloud, to the empty kitchen, to the house that was learning to be inhabited again, to whatever part of her grandmother's precision was still present in the walls and the light and the quality of the air. Tomorrow, she would go back to the barn. She did not sleep well that night, not from anxiety, or not only from anxiety, but from the particular alertness of someone whose mind has been given something significant to hold and cannot quite set it down long enough to rest. She lay in her grandmother's bed in the dark, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about the key on the nightstand beside her, the weight of it in her palm when she had closed her fingers around it that afternoon, the way it had felt less like finding a thing and more like being handed one. She thought about her grandmother. Cecelia Haller had been a woman of deliberate action, a woman who did not misplace things or leave matters unresolved or store objects carelessly. She had been a woman who, when she put something away, put it away in a specific place for a specific reason, and who expected that the person who eventually needed it would understand the reason when the time came. The key wrapped in oilcloth inside an unmarked envelope at the bottom of a box of personal effects was not an oversight. It was an address. Her grandmother had written it in the language she trusted most, which was the language of careful preparation, of objects arranged with intention, of the long patience of someone who believes the right person will eventually arrive at the right door. She was the right person. She understood that now in the way you understand things that have always been true but have required a particular accumulation of time and experience and loss before they become legible. Her grandmother had known it before she did. Her grandmother had known a great many things before she did, and Margaret was done being surprised by that, and done being ashamed of the years it had taken her to catch up. She got up at first light. She made coffee at the kitchen stove. Real coffee in the percolator she had found in the back of her grandmother's cabinet, the same percolator that had sat on this stove every morning of Margaret's childhood visits. And she drank it at the kitchen table looking out the east window at the field in the gray pre-dawn light, the way she imagined her grandmother had drunk her coffee at this table every morning for 60 years. And she felt the continuity of that, the long thread of it, and she held onto it. She put on her boots. She put the key in her coat pocket. She took the flashlight from the counter, and she went out into the early morning. The path through the south tree line was different in the morning than it had been in the afternoon. The light came through the canopy at a lower angle, and the forest floor was still and cool with the particular stillness of early morning in spring, the birds only beginning, the air carrying the smell of damp earth and new growth, and something under both of those, something older and more mineral, the smell of stone that has been in the same place for a very long time. She walked slowly. She was in no hurry. She had spent 41 years being in a hurry toward things that turned out not to matter, and she was done with that particular urgency. The barn came through the trees the same way it had come through them the previous afternoon, present before she expected it, solid and gray and patient. In the morning light, it looked different, the stone walls carrying a different quality of color, the iron brown of the padlock more vivid, the whole structure more clearly itself without the softening of the late afternoon gold. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it for a full minute. Then she walked to the door. She put the key in the padlock. It did not turn immediately. Of course it didn't. 30 years of disuse had stiffened every mechanism in that lock, and the key fit, but did not move, and she stood there with her hand on the key and breathed and thought about patience, about the specific patience of someone who is not doing this for speed but for truth. And she applied steady, even pressure, not force, and she felt the mechanism resist, and then with a quality of giving that was almost reluctant, as if the lock too had been waiting a long time and was not entirely sure it was ready. It turned. The padlock opened. She stood very still for a moment. The iron chain was stiff with rust, and she worked it carefully off the door hardware, the links releasing one by one. She set the padlock and chain on the ground at the base of the door. She put both hands on the door, and she pushed. The door did not want to open. 30 years of settling had shifted the frame slightly, and the bottom of the door had dragged against the threshold, and the wood had swollen and contracted through 3 decades of seasons until the fit was not quite right anymore. She pushed steadily and felt it resist, and pushed again, and it gave an inch, and then 2 inches, and then with a long, low sound that was part groan and part something else, something that was almost like a voice, it swung open. The air that came out was not stale. That was the first thing she noticed. She had expected the sealed mustiness of the farmhouse when she had first opened it, the enclosed sweetness of a space that has been holding its breath. But the barn breathed differently. There was air movement in it from the collapsed section of the roof, a slow circulation that had kept the interior from the deep stagnation she had anticipated. The smell was of old wood and stone, and something she identified after a moment as linseed oil, the particular smell of a substance used to preserve wood and metal over long periods, applied here deliberately, applied in quantity, applied by someone who intended things to last. She stepped inside and turned on the flashlight. The barn was divided. That was the first structural fact she understood in the sweep of the flashlight beam across the interior. The original space, which would have been the full working barn, was the larger section under the failed roofline, and that section was what had appeared from outside, damaged, the floor under the collapsed section rotted through, and the debris of the fallen roof material spread across it in a way that said years rather than recent. But beyond that, separated by an interior wall that had not been part of the original structure, Someone had built a room. The interior wall was stone, the same field stone as the exterior walls, but newer in its construction, the mortar between the courses paler and less weathered. It ran across the full width of the barn, approximately 30 feet in from the entry, and it was solid and plumb and clearly the work of someone who knew what they were doing. In the center of this interior wall was a second door, smaller than the entry door, fitted tight into the stone frame, made of the same heavy planked wood as the entry, but with hardware that was newer, iron fittings that had been treated with the same linseed oil she had smelled from the entry, protected against rust, functional. No padlock on this door. A bolt, drawn on the interior side, accessible only to someone who was already inside the main barn. Margaret crossed the outer space carefully, testing the floor with each step, keeping to the edges where the boards were oldest and most solid and farthest from the damage of the roof collapse. And she reached the interior wall, and she put her hand on the bolt and drew it back and pushed open the second door. The room behind it was approximately 20 by 30 feet. The ceiling was the intact portion of the barn's original roof, the slate tiles holding, the rafters sound. The floor was stone, the same field stone as the walls, laid as a proper floor rather than as dirt, fitted tight and level with the craftsmanship of someone who expected it to carry weight. The walls were stone. The air in here was different from the outer barn, drier, more still, the linseed oil smell stronger, and beneath it something that took her a moment to identify. Paper. Old paper. The specific smell of documents and books that have been stored carefully over long periods in a dry and stable environment. She swept the flashlight around the room. Along the west wall, floor-to-ceiling shelving, built from the same heavy lumber as the doors, fitted into the stone with iron brackets, solid and level. On the shelves, boxes. Wooden boxes, the kind made for specific storage purposes, made to measure, fitted with lids, each one labeled in handwriting she recognized before she was close enough to read the words. Her grandmother's handwriting. Along the east wall, a series of large flat storage containers, the kind used for oversized documents or artwork, stacked horizontally on purpose-built supports that kept them off the stone floor. Beside them, wrapped in heavy cloth that had been tied with cord, shapes she could not yet identify. In the center of the room, a table, heavy, the same wood as the shelves, and on the table, a single object. A tin box, old, the kind made to last in the era before fireproof safes were standard, and on the lid of the tin box, in her grandmother's handwriting, a single word. Maggie. Margaret stood in the center of the stone room with the flashlight in her hand and looked at that word for a long time. She was aware of her own breathing, of the steadiness she was requiring of herself, of the way the room seemed to hold her in a particular quality of attention, as if it had been arranged not just for storage, but for this specific moment of arrival. She thought about her grandmother placing that tin box on that table, labeling it with that name, in the specific and deliberate knowledge that the person who would eventually stand in this room and read it was her granddaughter. She crossed to the table. She set the flashlight on the wood so that it illuminated the tin box from the side. She put both hands on the lid and she worked it, because the lid was tight, fitted with the same care as every other fitted thing in this room, and it came open with the same quality of reluctant release as the padlock, as if even the smallest mechanisms in this room had been waiting and were not entirely sure they were ready to stop. Inside the tin box was a letter, several pages, folded, in an envelope with her name on the front. Under the letter, a set of keys on a labeled ring. Under the keys, a smaller envelope sealed with wax, the Holler family's old letter seal that Margaret had seen on documents in the county attorney's office, a simple H in a circle. She took out the letter first. She unfolded it at the table with the flashlight beside her, and she read. Her grandmother had written, "My dear Maggie, if you are reading this, you came back. I always believed you would come back when you were ready and not before, and I have prepared accordingly. I do not know how long it will have been. I do not know what will have happened to bring you here. I know only what I could see from where I stood, which was this, that you were a woman of considerable gifts living inside a life too small for them, and that the day would come when the life would give way and you would need a place to stand. This room and what it holds is that place. I am giving it to you not as charity and not as rescue because you have never needed either of those things, and I would not insult you with them. I am giving it to you as a reckoning. as the correction of an old injustice that your grandfather and I were not able to address in our lifetimes, but that we spent a great deal of effort preparing the ground for you to address in yours. Let me explain. Margaret sat down on the stone floor of the room, her back against the table, the letter in both hands, and she read everything her grandmother had written. The explanation took 3 pages. It was written in her grandmother's precise and economical hand, the handwriting of a woman who chose words the way she chose tools, for exactly what they could do and nothing they couldn't. It told Margaret things she had not known. Things about the land, about the family, about a decision made in 1962 that her grandfather had regretted for the rest of his life, and that her grandmother had spent 30 years quietly working to correct. In 1962, a man named Robert Ashby had come to the Holler property representing a land acquisition company out of Richmond. He had told Margaret's grandfather, a man named Thomas Holler who was 60 years old and tired and farming 43 acres alone after 2 bad harvests, that the South Field was worthless, that the soil was depleted, that the water table beneath it was unstable, that any investment in the South Field was money lost. He had offered to take the South Field off Thomas Holler's hands for a modest sum as a gesture of goodwill, to spare him the further expense of maintaining land that would yield nothing. Thomas Holler had not sold. Something about the man's smoothness had made him cautious. But he had believed the assessment, and he had stopped farming the South Field. And he had told Cecelia what the man from Richmond had said, and Cecelia had listened and had nodded and had said very little and had then spent the next 6 months conducting her own investigation. She had talked to the County Agricultural Extension Office. She had talked to a geologist at the State University who came and walked the South Field and looked at the soil and took samples and told her that the South Field was among the more productive parcels in the county, that the soil was deep and well-structured, and that there was nothing wrong with the water table. She had talked to a title researcher who found that the acquisition company Robert Ashby represented had, in the years following his visit to the Holler property, acquired 3 neighboring parcels under similar pretenses, all of them in the same geologic formation as the Holler South Field, all of them represented to their original owners as problematic or worthless. She had kept all of this. She had kept every document, every letter, every report, every piece of evidence she had gathered over the years that followed, organized and labeled and stored. She had kept it because she understood, even in 1963, even as a farmer's wife in Cedarwell County, Virginia, with no legal training and no institutional standing, that what Robert Ashby had done was fraud, that the pattern of what he had done across multiple properties was a demonstrable pattern of fraud, and that the evidence she was gathering had value, had weight, might someday be the instrument of a correction she could not yet see the shape of. She had kept the room secret, not from Thomas, who had known and who had helped her build the interior wall and fit the door and understand what she was preserving and why, but from everyone else, from children and neighbors and county officials and the acquisition company's successors, who had continued to operate in the area under different names over the following decades, who had approached the Holler property twice more in the intervening years with different representatives and the same smooth assessments of the land's worthlessness, and who had each time been sent away by Cecelia Holler with a brevity that left no room for further conversation. She had also kept something else. This was in the final page of the letter, and Margaret read it twice. In the boxes on the west wall shelving, her grandmother had written, "You will find documents." All of it is labeled and organized. The flat storage on the east wall contains other things, things your grandfather and I collected over 60 years in this house and in this family, things I want you to have and to understand the value of before you make any decisions about them. The value is not only financial, though the financial value is real and significant, and I want you to know it clearly so that you can act from information and not from uncertainty. At the bottom of the letter, in a postscript written in slightly different ink, as if added at a different time, her grandmother had written, "I know about your marriage, Maggie. Not everything, but enough. I kept this for you because I loved you and because I knew you were worth keeping things for. I hope the day you read this is a day you already know that too." Margaret sat on the stone floor for a long time after she finished reading. The flashlight beam fell across the shelves and the boxes and the flat storage and the cloth-wrapped shapes on the east wall and the table above her with the tin box open on it. She sat and she breathed and she let what she had read settle into her the way large things settle, slowly and with weight. Then she got up. She picked up the flashlight. And she began to look at what her grandmother had kept for her. If you're still here, still walking through this barn with Margaret, I need you to do something for me right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Stories like Margaret's are why this channel exists, and your support is what makes it possible to keep telling them. Now let's keep going, because what's in these boxes is going to change everything. She started with the shelves. The wooden boxes were organized by decade. She understood that immediately once she began reading the labels, her grandmother's system clear and logical once you had the key to it. Each box covered a period of years and contained within it the documentation her grandmother had gathered in those years, organized by date and by subject with the index cards tucked at the front of each box that listed the contents in order. The first box, labeled 1962 to 1965, contained the original materials. The Agricultural Extension Report, the Geologist's Assessment, the Title Search, the documented history of Robert Ashby's acquisitions in the county, letters, copies of letters her grandmother had written to the State Agricultural Department and to the Attorney General's office and to the county clerk, inquiries made with the careful precision of a woman who did not expect immediate results but was establishing a record. Response letters, some substantive and some the bureaucratic non-answers of offices too busy or too indifferent to act on the information a farmer's wife in Cedarwell County was providing them. Her grandmother had kept them all, the useful and the useless, because she understood that a record's value is in its completeness. The subsequent boxes traced the continuing story. The acquisition company's second approach to the property in 1971, documented. A third approach in 1984 under a different company name, but with traceable corporate connections to the original, documented. Her grandmother's investigations in each of those years, the additional evidence she had gathered, the expanding picture of what had happened and who had been responsible, and what the land had actually been worth all along. A correspondence in the mid-1980s with a Richmond attorney who had been investigating the acquisition pattern on behalf of several families. Letters that had stopped when the attorney died suddenly in 1987. The thread going cold, but the documentation preserved. And then, in the box labeled 1989 to 1994, something that made Margaret sit down on the stone floor again with the box in her lap. A geological survey, commissioned by her grandmother in 1991, paid for with money she had saved over years specifically for this purpose, conducted by a firm from the state capital. The survey covered the South Field in detail, the same South Field Robert Ashby had told Thomas Holler in 1962 was worthless, the same field the acquisition company had tried 3 times to obtain. The survey described, in the careful technical language of professional geology, the presence of significant mineral deposits in the subsurface of the South Field. Not lithium, the terminology was different, the science of it dated to 1991, but the substance was the same category of finding. Rare earth elements. The survey noted that extraction technology at the time of the survey made the deposits economically marginal, but included in the notes a section titled Future Considerations, in which the geologist had written that advances in extraction technology and changes in demand for rare earth materials could make these deposits substantially more valuable in the coming decades. Her grandmother had read this survey in 1991. She had put it in the box with its label and its index card. And she had waited. Margaret looked at the date on the survey. She thought about 1991. She had been married to Dennis for 15 years in 1991. She had been 40 years old, in the deep middle of the marriage, both children still at home, the house on Meridian Drive fully established, her own life fully subsumed into the management of his. Her grandmother had been reading a geological survey about the family land in 1991 and had understood what it meant and had put it away for safekeeping and had not told her, because in 1991 telling her would have meant telling Dennis. And Cecelia Holler had understood something about Dennis Solano in 1991 that Margaret had not yet understood about herself. She thought about the letter. I kept this for you because I loved you and because I knew you were worth keeping things for. She put the survey back in its box. She stood up. She went to the east wall. The flat storage containers were labeled on their sides in her grandmother's hand. She read the labels before she opened anything. Paintings, the first one said, Holler family, various dates. Documents, the second said, property and legal. Correspondence, the third, personal. The fourth container's label was different from the others, not a category, but a name. Elias Holler, it said, and under the name, a date. 1887 to 1951. Elias Holler had been her great-grandfather, the man who had built this barn, who had quarried the stone from the property and laid it with his own hands in the first decade of the 20th century. The man she knew from a single photograph in her grandmother's front room, a formal portrait from 1920 or thereabouts, a man with her grandfather's eyes and her grandmother's jaw, and the expression of someone who has worked hard all his life and is not particularly interested in making that look like anything other than what it is. She opened that container last, with the specific intention of saving it, of working up to it. She opened the paintings first. There were 7 of them, wrapped individually in the heavy cloth she had seen from the doorway, tied with cord, nested in the flat container with the care of someone packing things that matter for a long journey. She unwrapped the first one and held the flashlight over it, and looked at what she had. It was a landscape, a painting of a landscape, oil on canvas, the canvas old, the frame simple and dark-stained wood. The landscape was this valley. She recognized it immediately. The Cedarwell Valley in what appeared to be late summer, the mountains to the west in the particular haze of August, the fields in the foreground golden with what was not yet harvested, a house in the middle distance that was not the farmhouse as it stood now, but something earlier and smaller, the predecessor to the current structure. She turned the painting over. On the stretcher bar, in a hand she did not recognize, but that was clearly old, a name and a date. Thomas Cole, it said. 1838. She looked at the painting for a long time. She set it carefully against the wall. She unwrapped the second one. This one was smaller, a portrait, a woman she did not recognize but who had the Holler jaw, seated, a dark dress and a direct gaze and hands folded in her lap, with the particular composure of someone who does not find sitting for a portrait a difficult or interesting experience. She turned it over. Winslow Homer, the back said. 1878. She sat down on the floor of the stone room, very slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who needs a moment to be still. She sat with the Homer painting in her lap and the Cole painting against the wall beside her, and she looked at the flashlight beam on the ceiling of the room her grandmother had built to hold these things, and she understood, in a way that was not gradual but sudden and total, what she was sitting in. She was sitting in the product of 3 generations of knowing, of a family that had understood what it had, that had protected what it understood, that had kept faith with the people who would come after them with a patience and a love and a precision that she was only now, at 67 years old, in a position to fully receive. Her great-grandfather Elias Holler had collected these paintings in the latter half of the 19th century when such collecting, for a farming family in Cedarwell County, Virginia, was not obvious or common or easily explained. He had bought them from sources she would have to research, had kept them here on this land, had passed them to his son, and his son had passed them with the land to her grandparents. And her grandmother had built this room and cataloged what the room held, and kept it safe through 30 years of locked doors and deliberate silence, and the long patient faith of someone who knows that the right time and the right person will eventually coincide. She unwrapped all 7 paintings. She did not have the knowledge to identify all of them by herself, did not have the training to read the signatures with certainty in this light, but she had enough. She had enough to understand the scale of what her grandmother had preserved. She had enough to understand that the South Field with its rare earth deposits and the paintings in their careful wrappings and the documents in their labeled boxes were not separate things, but one thing, one long-sustained act of love directed with absolute precision at a woman who had spent 41 years being told she was lucky to be cared for, and was only now beginning to understand what care actually looked like. She sat in the stone room until the light through the open door changed, and she understood from the quality of it that the morning had become afternoon. She had not eaten. She had not noticed. She gathered herself up from the stone floor with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been somewhere far away and is returning to the practical requirements of the present, and she wrapped the paintings back in their cloths with the care they deserved, and she replaced the lids on the boxes she had opened, and she went back through the second door and the first door into the clearing. The afternoon was warm, and the birds were fully in voice, and the clearing held the light in the specific way it held it in late spring, bright and direct, and full of the quality that made you feel that the world was more itself than it usually managed to be. She stood in it for a moment. Then she walked back through the trees to the farmhouse. She called Patricia Drummond from the kitchen table. Patricia listened to everything without interrupting, which was one of the qualities Margaret had come to appreciate most about her. When Margaret finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone organizing a significant amount of information. "You need an art appraiser," she said. "Someone with museum credentials, not a general antiques dealer. I know someone at the State University's art history department who consults on estate work. I can have her call you this week." "And the geological materials," Margaret said. "The surveys your grandmother commissioned," Patricia said, "are your documentation. But you'll want a current survey done by your own geologist to establish present-day value. The technology and the market have both changed significantly since 1991. I can recommend a firm." "And the fraud documentation," Margaret said. "The Robert Ashby materials. The pattern of acquisitions." Patricia was quiet for another moment. Then she said, carefully, "That material is old. The individuals involved are likely dead. But the corporate structures may not be, and if the companies that conducted those acquisitions still exist in any form, or if their assets were transferred to successor entities, the documentation your grandmother kept could be relevant to claims on behalf of the affected families. That would be a separate matter from your own situation. I want to understand the full picture," Margaret said. "Before I do anything else, I want to know exactly what I have." "That's the right first step," Patricia said. "That's always the right first step." The art historian came on a Thursday, a woman named Dr. Anita Vasquez, who was 45 and precise, and who walked into the stone room behind Margaret with the particular quality of controlled professional attention that conceals, inadequately if you know what to look for, a significant amount of excitement. She spent 2 hours with the paintings, the quality 2 hours of silence and very close looking and the occasional quiet note into the recorder she carried. And then she came out into the clearing and looked at Margaret with an expression that was not quite what Margaret had been prepared for. It was not surprise. Dr. Vasquez was too experienced for pure surprise. It was recognition, the expression of someone whose professional knowledge has just encountered something that confirms rather than contradicts what that knowledge has always indicated was possible. "The coal is authentic," she said. "I would stake my professional reputation on it. The Homer is authentic. 2 of the others I am highly confident about and would need laboratory analysis to be certain. But the provenance context here," she gestured at the barn, at the room, at the land, "is itself significant supporting evidence." She paused. "Mrs. Solano, do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Tell me plainly," Margaret said. "At current market," Dr. Vasquez said, "the coal alone would achieve between 4 and 7 million at major auction. The Homer, depending on the specific work in the auction house and the market conditions, could exceed that. The others, if they are what I believe them to be, add significantly to that figure." She paused again. "The collection as a whole, properly authenticated and presented, is one of the most significant private discoveries of American 19th century art in this region in decades." Margaret looked at the stone barn, at the walls her grandfather had built from the land itself, at the door her grandmother had locked 30 years ago with a key she had stored in oilcloth inside an envelope at the bottom of a box that would sit in a county attorney's office for 11 years waiting for the right person to collect it. She thought about Dennis Solano telling her over 41 years, in 100 different registers and on 100 different occasions, that she had trouble thinking things through. She thought about Nathan, who had learned from his father how to take up space, and who had called her twice in the weeks after the divorce papers were served, both times in the tone of a man who believes that a woman who has made a unilateral decision has made an irrational one and needs to be redirected toward reason. She thought about Claire, who had not called at all. They had not known about the property on Holler Road. Or rather, they had known it existed in the vague way you know about things you have decided are not worth attending to. Dennis had asked about it once, in the early years, and she had said it was her grandmother's old farm, nothing much, and he had moved on, because he had decided it was not worth attending to, because he had made the same assessment Robert Ashby had made 60 years before him, that the land was probably marginal, that the woman who stood between him and it was manageable, that patience would eventually yield him what he wanted without effort. He had been wrong about everything. Her grandmother had known he would be. She looked at Dr. Vasquez. "What do we do next?" she said. Dr. Vasquez told her. "Authentication process, documentation, selection of auction house, the timeline of it, the sequence." She was specific and organized, and clearly someone who had done this before and was good at it. Margaret listened and asked precise questions, and took notes on the back of an envelope she found in her coat pocket, the same way her grandmother had taken notes on whatever was at hand, in the clear, economical handwriting of a woman who writes what she needs to remember and does not waste space. That evening, Margaret walked back through the tree line to the clearing one more time alone. She stood in front of the stone barn in the last light of the day, and she looked at it. The door was closed. She had pulled it shut behind her when she left, though she had not replaced the padlock and chain, because the barn was no longer sealed, and she saw no reason to make it appear that it was. She thought about what the room held. She thought about her grandmother in this clearing 30 years ago, pulling the chain through the door hardware and snapping the padlock closed, and walking back through the trees with the knowledge of what she was leaving behind and the long faith of what she was leaving it for. She thought about the letter. "I kept this for you because I loved you and because I knew you were worth keeping things for." 67 years old, standing in a clearing in Cedarwell County, Virginia in the last light of a May evening, with a barn full of the careful love of 3 generations behind her and 43 acres of her own land under her feet, and a geological survey on a table in a stone room indicating that the south field her great-grandfather had farmed and Robert Ashby had called worthless, and her grandmother had known all along was not, that the south field was still doing what good land does, which is to say it was still providing, still yielding, still carrying the long, patient wealth of what had been placed in it by people who understood its worth. She was not the woman who had driven away from Meridian Drive 6 weeks ago. Or rather, she was exactly that woman. But the woman had become more herself in 6 weeks than she had been in 41 years, and the difference between those two states was the difference between a room sealed against the world and a room opened at last to the person it had been waiting for. Tomorrow the geologist was coming. Tomorrow, and all the days after it, were hers. The geologist confirmed what her grandmother had always known. The appraiser confirmed what her great-grandfather had quietly collected. The attorneys confirmed what Cecelia Haller had spent 30 years documenting in careful handwriting in labeled boxes in a locked stone room. Dennis heard about it the way people hear about the things they overlooked secondhand, too late, with nothing left to claim. He did not call. There was nothing to say. Margaret sat at her grandmother's kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in June, coffee in hand, light coming through the east window exactly as it always had, and she was, at last, entirely herself. Some doors, when they finally open everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.